Thank you very much for coming to our presentation. Robert and I have studied NDE phenomena together for over 50 years from a spiritual scientific perspective. Neither of us has had the extraordinary experience of an NDE. We began our formal research in earnest in 2005. We are going to present the idea that the mind and the brain are two distinct things that interact together to allow us to be conscious while we are in our bodies. The important questions are, how does a non-material mind actually interact with the physical brain? And how does the mind work with the brain? You can read more about our research at our website, selfconsciousmind.com. Most of what we say in our talks is intentionally shown on our slides so that afterwards others can read and fully understand our presentations when found on YouTube and by thousands of researchers on ResearchGate. Substance dualism is a branch of philosophy that holds that two fundamentally or ontologically distinct kinds of things exist, mind and matter. Even though they are different kinds of things, the mind and matter, that is, the brain, can causally affect each other. In their recent book, philosophers Brandon Rickabaugh and J.P. Moreland describe the mind or soul as a fundamental, immaterial spiritual substance. The human person, in their view, is comprised of a soul and a physical body, is capable of existing without a body, but not without his or her soul, and the mental life of which is possessed and unified by his or her soul. Rickabaugh and Moreland define how a substance dualist would describe a thing that has mental states. It would be an entity that exemplifies mental properties, holistically unifies mental properties, has continuing mental states, refers to itself as I, has an irreducible first-person point of view. When disembodied, is a unified center of consciousness, displays the power to be necessarily a thinker of thoughts, and exercises active power and purposefully guides deliberative processes toward an end. Philosophy is limited to defining what makes a thing that has mental states, but philosophy does not provide a causal explanation for conscious states. However, a research project based on the empirical evidence from NDE reports can be the basis for a substance dualist ontological framework. Note, NDE research based on a substance dualist framework has been underway for more than 30 years.
Here is a brief history of NDE substance dualist research. Kenneth Arnett's theory of essence and our mind entity framework were initially developed independently. We have collaborated with Kenny since 2010, and we acknowledge the scientific priority of his work. None of us is aware of any other published interactionist dualist models extensively using NDE evidence. Both of our theories are based primarily on NDE evidence. Both propose an autonomous, non-material mind or essence that interacts with the physical body and brain and continues to exist independently of the body during NDEs and after physical death. Both propose a mechanism for mind-brain interaction based on electrical brain interactions which give rise to consciousness, perceptions, thoughts, memory, motor actions, and unconscious mental effects. Both propose a mechanism for the mind essence to causally trigger neural activity and causally interact with the neural electrical fields to become aware of sensory percepts. The primary differences are in the details of the causal connections between the mind and the brain. In this presentation, we will focus on the results of our research. Here is our line of reasoning. Our scientific research is based on the phenomenology of NDEers' subjective experiences. In an NDE, the locus of the NDEer's awareness shifts from being within the body to outside the body with veridical perceptions of the surroundings. When out of body, the mind appears to be a non-material field of consciousness, a region of space where the person's consciousness exists. The NDEer generally reports having some sort of non-material body, variously described as translucent, cloud-like, or an energy pattern. Tibor Putnaki describes this illustration from his book, saying, "My immaterial body appears to be me as substanceless, and yet it still has a shape, sort of amoeba-like. It looks like a TV screen when there is no program on, but there are black and white lights that are vibrant and flickering. The whole body is like this. I'm a weightless floating thing." When out of body, the mind operates with its full mental faculties, although the body and brain have ceased to function. The NDEer appears to be a continuous, seamless experience of the same self who retains a continuity of memory from before the start of the NDE to after the return to the body. We propose that the NDEer's autonomous mind is the person's consciousness itself. It is the person, him or herself, the person's mind entity. When embodied, the non-material mind entity is a three-dimensional field that is coextensive with the brain and body, merging with the brain and nervous system and operating through neural activity. When embodied, the mind is intimately integrated with the physical body and therefore must interact in some way with the brain and body. At some level, this interaction has a physical effect within the neurons, resulting in conscious awareness. On the cause of all NDEs, a study by Vanessa Charlin-Verville and colleagues showed no significant difference in intensity or content between NDEs associated with life-threatening events like cardiac arrest resulting in coma and NDE-like experiences occurring, for instance, during sleep, fainting, meditation, or alcohol use. This result suggests that there is a common proximate cause of all NDEs, a common mechanism resulting in the NDE. We argue that the separation of the mind entity from the physical body is the proximate cause of all NDEs. This position was confirmed by a 2024 analysis of NDE scale data from 565 NDEs. We selected the 9 separation-related features of the scale that directly or indirectly imply the separation of consciousness from the physical body. When listed in the order of prevalence, separated from the body accounted for more than 80% of cases. The top 2 features accounted for nearly 95% of cases, and all 9 features accounted for more than 99% of cases. The 9 separation features describe a coherent course of events, beginning with a separation of the NDEer's consciousness from the physical body, suggesting that NDEs are universal regardless of the triggering event.
The empirical study of NDEs is valid. The best estimate is that about 5% of the world's population, about 400 million people worldwide, have had an NDE. NDEs have consistent, well-defined characteristic features with remarkable uniformity of the NDE elements for people of all ages and across many cultures. For example, about 35% report hearing the same idiosyncratic admonition: "You must go back. It's not your time. You have more to do on earth." NDE accounts are empirical observations. NDEers are credible eyewitnesses to their experiences. Independent cooperation from other credible witnesses of the phenomenon provides further objective evidence to the NDEer's testimony. Memories of the NDE are more real than ordinary memories, do not change over time, and are dependable. NDE accounts provide objective empirical evidence. Elements reported by millions of NDEers represent a common, objective reality witnessed and shared by many people, providing strong objective evidence. Therefore, researchers are justified in accepting NDEs as providing valid data for scientific study, using the same rigorous empirical observations as in any other field of science. The mind entity fulfills Rickabaugh and Moreland's 8 substance dualist criteria for a thing that has mental states. In an NDE, the mind entity separates from the physical body, leaving the body effectively dead, and later rejoins and re-enlivens the body. Hundreds of millions of these cases show that the mind entity is essentially, wholly, and intrinsically distinct from the physical body and is the carrier of the body's forces. How does the mind entity fulfill the substance dualist criteria? The mind entity possesses mental and cognitive faculties of perception, thought, volition, memory, and feeling. It's a thinking, perceiving, feeling, and volitional being. Its mental and cognitive faculties are unified in the mind entity as the center of consciousness. The mind entity refers to itself as I. Its faculties are exercised through a first-person perspective. It endures over time and has a continuous sense of self in the body and out of body. It's a thinking being with a capacity to intuit, reason, analyze, and plan, and it has a sense of agency to direct its will toward purposeful ends. The empirical evidence from NDE shows that the mind entity is not only metaphysically possible, but is also metaphysically real and is a separate ontological category distinct from the physical body and other physical objects. Here are some basic neurological principles. Cortical gray matter is the major component in the upper 2 to 4 millimeters of the cerebral cortex, consisting of neural cells. Pyramidal cortical neurons make up most of the neurons in the gray matter of the cortex. They have vertical apical dendrites, reaching from the soma to the surface, and basal dendrites branching out horizontally from the soma. Dendritic spines are tiny nodules on the surface of the dendrites. Neurons connect to other neurons through a synapse from the axon of one neuron to the dendritic spine of the other. The sending neuron releases a neurotransmitter that activates the receiving neuron spine and dendrite. Excitatory neurotransmitters can lead to an accumulation of charge in the soma, causing the neuron to generate an action potential. Inhibitory neurotransmitters can prevent the neuron from firing. We propose a second purpose for dendritic spines, that the mind entity can also trigger action potentials by interacting with the spines.
Another principle is the modular cortical organization of the brain. The cortex is organized in specialized domains or modules responsible for specific mental functions such as recognition of faces, words, shapes, speech, language, pitch, places, and so on. The evidence for these domains comes from functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI studies, which associate activation of a specific module with specific mental activities. The domains can be very specific in function. Related functions can have overlapping domains. For example, separate and overlapping domains for addition, subtraction, and multiplication mental operations. There are also a number of generalized domains in the frontal and parietal regions that support general purpose cognitive and neural mechanisms, from mental arithmetic to holding information in working memory to filtering and suppressing task irrelevant information. We need to cover the basic mind entity principles for embodied consciousness. The mind entity framework differs radically differently from the physicalist neuroscientific framework. The mind entity is a unitary being, a separate ontological category. It is the seat of consciousness, the locus of personal identity, separate from the physical body. It is the being or soul of the individuated person. Brain processes do not generate consciousness. There are no neural calculations, no neural representations of mental content. There is no neural storage of short-term or long-term memories or of working memory. The mind entity can exist in two different states, embodied within a physical body or separate from it. During embodiment, neural activity supports the mind's cognitive faculties. Therefore, the mind must be able to work with the brain to detect and to induce neural activity. The presence of neural activity, except in sensory areas, indicates the activity of the mind to bring its mental content to awareness. Embodied awareness requires cortical neural activity. Neural activity from the primary senses produces percepts. Neural activity induced or triggered by the mind brings conceptual content to awareness. Memory is carried in the mind rather than stored in the brain. The hippocampi act as an interface with the mind. Recall that all declarative and episodic memories are accessible during the NDE, and new episodic memories are formed during the NDE. So-called long-term potentiation occurs with the mind's repeated activity in memory formation and recall by using common hippocampal neural pathways.
We need to describe the mind entity's interactions with physical processes. To begin with, evidence of interactions of the out-of-body with physical matter. The NDE felt resistance passing through solid matter, layers of insulation, a door. The NDE sensed penetrating a person's body as a rarefied gelatin with electricity running through it, or a thick liquid. A person's body pushed or wafted the NDE's body. The NDE's body interacted with a person's body, and the person reacted as if tickled. The NDE merged with a person's body and could see through their eyes and hear their thoughts. Here are different forms of interactions. Accurate visual perceptions, depending on ambient light, imply interaction with electromagnetic radiation, light waves. Accurate auditory perceptions imply interaction with sound vibrations, coherent movements of air molecules. Accurate olfactory perceptions imply interaction with the unique molecular structures of odoriferous substances. Subtle interactions with solid surfaces, touching solid surfaces, bobbing against the ceiling, imply interaction with a solid surface. Sudden movement of a person, pushing the NDE or causing a wafting of their form, implies a pressure against the NDE's body. Interactions with living tissue with a sensation of a viscous or gelatinous substance imply a weaker interaction within a living body than passing through solid matter. Interactions passing through solid objects, a resistance or change in density, imply interaction with the solid object's rigid matrix of electrons and atomic nuclei. Feeling electricity when penetrating another person's body, and the ability to merge with a person and interface with their neural activity imply an interaction to sense neural action potentials. The ability to tickle a person causing the person to react imply interactions with neurons to induce neural action potentials. Now to analyze the forms of physical interactions. The out-of-body NDE perceives directly without physical sense organs in these ways. Visually via direct interaction with the electromagnetic waves of visible light. Auditorily with the sound vibrations of molecules in the air. Tactily with the molecules at the surface of solid objects. Olfactorily with the molecular structures of specific substances. Senses resistance when penetrating the atoms and molecules in fluids or solid objects. Therefore, the mechanisms of the mind entities' interactions are in the order of increasing density of matter and force of resistance. Interactions with the weak force of electromagnetic waves, photons in light. Interactions with the weak force of the molecular shape of volatile or odoriferous substances. Interactions with the weak resistant forces of air molecules in sound waves. Interactions with the somewhat stronger resistant forces of the molecules within fluids or within a living organism's body. Interactions with the strong resistance forces in the densely packed matrix of atomic nuclei and electrons in solid matter. Resistance experienced in solid matter indicates that the mind entity can exert a subtle force on physical matter. According to Newton's third law of motion, the force of interaction with a solid matter is a two-way push-pull force.
How does the mind detect action potentials? Evidence of the mind's ability to detect neural activity comes from reports of feeling electricity when penetrating another person's arm, and the NDE's ability to merge with the person, interface with their neural activity, and later report their thoughts. We propose that the spiking of neural action potentials in the cortex can be detected by the mind. Neurons at rest have a strongly negative charge. An action potential is a sudden pulse of positive charge starting in the soma and quickly spreading outward towards the dendritic arbor, through the dendritic arbor. This short video shows an action potential spike in a single level 2, level 3 mouse neuron in the primary visual cortex in vivo. The neuron was injected with a voltage-sensitive dye to show the change in voltage. Dark blue is minus 75 millivolts when the neuron is at rest. Yellow is 0 millivolts, and dark red is plus 25 millivolts. The neuron is at rest, dark blue. There is excitation in a dendrite, light blue. The soma quickly reaches a peak, dark red. The positive charge quickly propagates backwards, red-orange. The neuron quickly returns to resting state, light blue to dark blue. The mind detects the simultaneous coherent spiking of numerous neurons in a specific brain region, bringing specific mental content to awareness. How does the mind induce action potentials? We propose that the mind triggers action potentials in specific brain regions to bring its mental content to awareness. Otherwise, the mental content remains subliminal. So, how does the mind trigger action potentials? Volatile or inhalational anesthetics like diethyl ether or isoflurane readily cause the loss of consciousness and therefore inhibit the action of the mind. Volatile anesthetics also alter the properties of the dendritic spines on the pyramidal neurons, shown here in red. The volatile anesthetics pass through the spine wall and unravel the spine's cytoskeleton, causing the spines temporarily to shrink and collapse. This diagram shows the effects of isoflurane anesthetic. The normal spine structure is at the top. Then, with isoflurane at clinical concentrations, the spines have shrunk and collapsed in the middle. These effects are reversed when the anesthetic is washed out and the cytoskeleton has reassembled at the bottom. The internal spine cytoskeleton consists of numerous microfilaments of a substance called F-actin. The F-actin filaments maintain the spine's shape and rigidity. F-actin filaments are polymers of a basic actin unit strung together. These structural filaments are unraveled by volatile anesthetics and can subsequently be reassembled. Volatile anesthetics cause the loss of consciousness. They also unravel the F-actin filaments in dendritic spines. Because these facts appear to be related, we propose the interface for the mind to trigger action potentials is located in the dendritic spines. The mechanism of interaction must rely on interaction of the mind with spine F-actin filaments and would be disrupted by anesthetics, preventing mind-induced in neural activity and subjective awareness. We propose such an interface and mechanism exists in the dendritic spines. Ordinarily, the spines make neuron-to-neuron connections in which an axon impulse triggers neurotransmitter release at the synapse with the spine. In addition, we propose a mind-to-neuron connection wherein the mind triggers cortical action potentials by exerting a slight force against F-actin filaments, which mechanically releases positive calcium ions to trigger the action potential. The main functional elements in the spine to do this are the spine apparatus compartment, SA, an extension of the cell's endoplasmic reticulum containing a store of calcium ions, red. Ryanodine, RYR, ion channels, which release calcium ions from the spine apparatus into the spine when triggered, orange. F-actin filaments anchored on a synaptopodin, or SP, protein, next to and touching the RYR channel, green. Mechanical coupling between the F-actin SP assembly and the adjacent RYR channel triggers the channel's opening, green and red, green and orange, touching. Circa calcium pumps, which transfer excess calcium ions from the spine's intracellular fluid back into the spine apparatus store, gray. The force of the mind entity on the filaments is sufficient to open the RYR channels. A sufficient calcium ion release triggers an action potential. The Circa pumps transfer calcium ions from the spine's intracellular fluid back into the spine apparatus. A conceptual model of the mind interface spine shows how these elements are arranged. The mind entity impresses its field into the cortical gray matter and penetrates the spines. The mind triggers the release of calcium ions from the spine apparatus by interacting mechanically with the spine apparatus filaments. The force needed to trigger the F-actin filaments is likely very small, probably comparable to the subtle resistance NDEs report when passing through solid matter. To demonstrate this, the mind entity's force against the filaments moves synaptopodin proteins against their adjacent RYR channels, causing a brief mind-induced calcium release. The positive calcium ions flow into the dendrite down into the soma. Enough dendritic spikes can then trigger an action potential. The action potential in turn causes an influx of calcium ions back throughout the dendrites and spines. The calcium ions are stored again in the spine apparatus, resetting the neuron for further action potentials. Similar calcium-driven mechanisms are well understood and operate throughout the body, for example, in regulating the heartbeat and skeletal muscle contractions.
The mind entity does not act on individual spines, but rather on segments of a brain region, probably on the order of a cortical column, containing 7,000 neurons, about half a millimeter in diameter. In activating a cortical column, the mind entity would activate countless dendritic spines. Calcium ions released from countless spines generate widespread action potentials in the brain region, which the mind detects as a surge of neural activity in the region. The activation of specific brain regions brings certain mental content into awareness. Neural activity mirrors this content to the mind, which then becomes conscious of it. In the mind entity theory, the mind activates cortical regions, depending on the mental content, except in the primary sensory regions for sight, hearing, and touch. Since the primary sensory areas are purely input modalities, the mind does not activate these areas. These points suggest that there should be more dendritic spines in temporal and frontal regions compared to the primary sensory regions. This prediction is validated by studies done by Guy Elston, for example, in estimating the number of spines in different regions of the cortex. In the human brain, the dendritic spine densities are significantly higher in the temporal and frontal lobes compared with the occipital lobe. How does the mind work with the brain? First, the phenomena of delayed awareness and subliminality. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet found that it takes time for neural activation to build up to conscious awareness. Libet's time-bound principle states that subjective awareness requires a minimum duration of 300 to 500 milliseconds of neural activity. Otherwise, the stimulus remains unconscious, a subliminal stimulation. Libet distinguished between detection and subjective awareness. Before awareness occurs, the stimulus is still detected. Responses can happen within 100 milliseconds, such as braking a car when a child appears suddenly in the street. If neural activity duration is under 300 milliseconds, the stimulus stays subliminal and does not reach conscious awareness, but is still detected by the mind, such that the driver instinctively avoids hitting the child. Secondly, the phenomenon of coming to awareness. Coming to awareness or ignition was confirmed by the study done in 2001 by Stanislaus Dehaene and later studies. Dehaene found that a visual word that is flashed for only 30 milliseconds remains readable. However, when the word is presented immediately followed by a masking image, the word becomes indistinct or even invisible. When words are visible, unmasked, there is propagation of neural activation and ignition of large-scale correlated brain regions. There is a sudden coherent activation of specific brain regions that code for the specific mental content. The process of coming to awareness applies to all awareness of sensory perceptions and also of thoughts, imaginations, etc. In our view, the primary function of neural activations is to make mental content conscious.
Neuroscientist Francisco Varela introduced neurophenomenology, a method that correlates the subject's first-person accounts with the observed neural activity. Applying the method to a specific cognitive task, Varela and colleagues showed a striking correlation between neural activity and the subject's subjective experiences. Subjects viewed a three-dimensional autostereoscopic image as the screen shifted from random dots to a distinct image. They were trained to identify their subjective experiences as they tried to focus on the screen to be ready for the image to appear. These scans show one subject's results for two trials. Time is on the x-axis. The subject prepares in the first half, and the image is shown in the middle. On the top row, the subject had focused attention, shown by the synchronous EEG lines in the frontal region, quickly recognized the image, and responded in 273 milliseconds. On the second row, the subject was distracted, shown by the lack of synchrony beforehand, was surprised when the image began to be visible, shown by the weaker disorganized synchrony, and responded in 520 milliseconds. The subject's different subjective experiences matched the EEG patterns. These studies demonstrated that the mind's activity can be studied both with objective measurements and with introspection of the subject's experiences in an experimental setting. The uniqueness of the mind's activity in each trial is reflected in the brain's neural signature. Its unique neural signature mirrors the subject's cognitive strategy or aptitude to perform the perceptual task. The mind's idiosyncratic activity appears as idiosyncratic neural activity, which strongly suggests that the mind drives the brain's activity. In our view, the mind's activity is the crucial determinant of the experimental result. In our view, the mind is engaged throughout the process of coming to awareness, from detection to subjective awareness. The mind induces its neural content by activating the specific brain regions for that cognitive content. The neural activations in these regions bring the mental content to subjective awareness. To explore how the mind works with the brain, we'd like to examine what goes on in the brain when we read a word. The distinctive EEG pattern called N400 shows that the mind proceeds in distinct steps over time and in distinct brain regions during perception and comprehension. When reading words one by one, an incongruent word in a sentence evokes a strong minus voltage. In this graph, minus voltages are plotted up, and time is on the x-axis. In reading a word, there is a typical pattern of electrical activity for about half a second. Ordinarily, the pattern follows this lower trace, the black line. But when one reads an incongruent word in a sentence, there is an unusual, strong minus voltage peaking at 400 milliseconds, called N400. When we read words in a sentence, the earlier words establish the context. Then when we read the next word, as in "the Dutch trains are yellow," the word yellow fits with the context of Dutch trains. So in our view, the full process for reading a single word happens this way. At 115 milliseconds, The N1 minus voltage peak is associated with detecting the word percept, the form of the word. The target word in the sentence shown here is yellow, as in the Dutch trains are yellow. At 200 milliseconds, the P2 plus voltage peak is associated with detecting the meaning of the word, the meaning or concept of yellow, namely a bright warm color. At 400 milliseconds, the minus voltage peak is associated with awareness of how congruent or incongruent the word is in context. Yellow is congruent because the trains in fact are yellow, an example of world knowledge, and the trace follows the typical neural pattern of the black line. If we say the Dutch trains are white or sour, there is a large peak at N400 because white is incongruent and sour is really anomalous. So perception and comprehension proceed in three distinct stages in time. First, detect the form of the word. Second, recognize the meaning of the word. Finally, evaluate the word's meaning in the current context as the word comes to awareness. The mind is involved at each stage. In reading a single word, the mind also engages three specific regions of the brain, as can be shown using magnetoencephalography, MEG. These images are MEG recordings of reading a novel word, producing a large magnetic N400M, similar to the N400 recordings. At 115 milliseconds, activation in the medial occipital area is associated with detecting the word percept or form. Note that this is showing the inside or medial surface of the right hemisphere. At 165 milliseconds, activation in the fusiform and occipital temporal areas on the outer left hemisphere is associated with detecting the meaning of the word or concept in the visual word form area. At 400 milliseconds, activation in superior temporal and prefrontal areas in the outer left hemisphere is associated with awareness of the word in the current context. Each new word adds to and builds the context of the sentence in the mind. Note the timing gap between steps 1 and 2, called pause A, and steps 2 and 3, called pause B. For pause A, in this gap, we propose the mind recognizes the percept as the form of an English word, intuits its meaning, and activates the next region, the visual word form area. For pause B, in this gap, we propose the mind recognizes the concept of the word and evaluates the congruity or incongruity of the word in the context of the sentence. The mind activates the next regions to bring the revised context of the sentence to awareness. There is no apparent neural activity during the pauses that warrant a neural basis for the mind's activity during these pauses. We envision that the mind entity's three-dimensional field is coextensive with the brain's cortical surface, including sulci. Rather than standing apart from the brain, the mind merges with every part of the cortex, activating specific locations depending on its mental content. We propose the neural activation in the region mirrors the mind's mental content back to itself. The activation illuminates its mental content so the mind can become aware of it. As an analogy, physical embodiment is like being imprisoned in darkness. In a completely dark room, a man can stand in front of a mirror but will not see the message written on his forehead. If he shines a flashlight at the mirror, the reflected light will illuminate his forehead so he can read the message. When the mind has a thought, it triggers neural activity so the activity can illuminate its thought. To illustrate the process of coming to awareness in more detail, the mind first receives the intuition of some mental content, for example, the meaning of a word, the yellow arrow. The mind activates the brain module associated with that type of concept, the red arrow. The neural activation in that module acts as a mirror to illuminate that mental content in the mind. Finally, the conceptual content comes to awareness, the orange arrow. In 1914, Rudolf Steiner similarly described the mind's activity in coming to awareness of our thoughts. Substituting modern terminology, he said, mental activity first lays hold of the brain and sets in motion neural activity. By this means, the neurons become a mirror apparatus. The thought is reflected and the soul becomes conscious of the thought. Thus, there are two phases. First, the mind's work on the brain in preparation of the experience. Then, after the mind has prepared the ground, the awareness takes place. The preparatory work on the brain remains entirely unconscious.
The weight of empirical evidence from NDEs, in addition to empirical neuroscientific evidence, establishes the validity of an additional ontological category, the mind entity or soul, which has philosophical validity as a form of substance dualism. The mind entity soul defines the thinking thing. A change of conceptual framework. The mind entity is the seat of consciousness. Brain processes do not generate consciousness. Rather, neural activity triggered by the mind enables the mind to come to awareness. There are no neural calculations, no neural representations of mental content, no neural storage of memories. An additional category of experimental data, namely first-person experiential reports used as valid empirical data as in neurophenomenology, rather than the use of computer simulations or mathematical modeling. A change of terminology. The mind triggers action potentials in specialized regions and detects neural activity by back propagation versus performing calculations through synaptic connections and feed-forward and feedback connectivity. Incommensurability. A new framework revises the interpretation of neurological processes. It should be evaluated from its own reference point. The framework's entire conceptual web must be laid down again on nature whole. Validation of substance dualism. Rickabaugh and Moreland suggested that a substance dualist research project could use the empirical data on NDEs to provide causal explanations of consciousness. Empirical evidence from NDEs supports the idea that the mind can separate from the body, implying the existence of a mind entity, a non-material, spatially extended field of consciousness, which is the locus of awareness of a human being. The features and properties of the mind entity fit the substance dualist list for a thing that has mental states. Thus, the empirical evidence from NDE shows that the mind entity is not only metaphysically possible, but can also be considered metaphysically real as a separate ontological category distinct from the physical body. In support of these propositions, we have described a framework for embodied consciousness, plausible mechanisms for mind-brain interactions, and for the functional relationships between the mind and brain. In our view, the evidence from NDE empirical phenomena validates the philosophical stance of substance dualism. A draft of the paper that this talk is based on is available on our website, selfconsciousmind.com. We have further research papers and a book planned to extend our NDE research. Thank you for your attention.